Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Jesus answered him, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus said to him, How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? Jesus answered, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Do not marvel that I said to you, You must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear its sound, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. Nicodemus said to him, How can these things be? Jesus answered him, Are you the teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things? Truly, truly, I say to you, we speak of what we know and bear witness to what we have seen, but you do not receive our testimony. If I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven except he who has descended from heaven, the Son of Man. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment, that light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. Hey, thank you for coming to the 116 podcast, where from faith for faith we are unashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I am your host, Trevor Ulrich. It is good to be with you today. I hope that your week has been great. Here in Ohio, finally, we are starting to get some warmer weather. We had the snow melt last week, and I thought we were finally on an uphill an uphill climb toward the springtime, but then we immediately started descending back into the winter with a dusting of snow, and by dusting I mean about 2 inches of snow. Well, finally it melted again, and if I'm looking at the weather correctly now, for my fellow Ohioans or Midwesterners, you know that the weather could change at the drop of a hat, and we could be cold again, but we're supposed to be in the 70s next week, near the 70s, about 69 to 71 degrees, and I'm excited about this, and my dogs are loving it. The sun is shining. I was able to get some yard work done yesterday while the computer decided it didn't want to work. And, it is just, I'm so excited for the better weather. Just winter brings so much depression and so much just negativity to so many different people. And, just the sunshine, there's scientific evidence, but even in the passage that we just read, there's good in light. Now that passage that was talking about was the light is Jesus, and the light that he brings, and the spiritual light that he brings. But there's just always something good about light, and something good about us being exposed to light. And I think that's true even in a scientific sense. When the weather improves, the sun isn't hidden behind clouds, and it's warmer out, it just moods boost. People have higher morale, and so I'm excited about it. I know that I've seen some friends starting to already have a boost in morale. I've also seen some friends start to go into sickness, because that's what this time of year brings. But hey, I'm excited about the spring. I'm excited for what this year brings. Remember, if you would, pray for my wife and I, as we are expecting our child. No, we don't know the gender yet. Yes, I am hoping for a boy, but we don't know the gender of our child yet. But just keep praying for us as we continue through this. Pray for my wife, that she would be healthy. Pray for our child, that I'm going to say he, because I want it to be a boy, that he would be healthy. yeah, and then also just pray for God's provision, that we have certain needs within our lives here. One is, like I said before, this room that I'm in right now is going to be the baby's room, and so all of these books have to scatter, and so we have to do some work in the garage, and then also turn our laundry room into a laundry/pet room, so that way then what you don't see off to the side here are the dog's crates and where the cat does her business and things like that. And so obviously none of that can be in the same room as the baby, and I wouldn't want it to be in the same room as the baby, so we have to do some work in our laundry room. And so just pray that God would give time, that God would give provision for those projects. I'm excited to do these things with my dad and some other friends of mine as well. And like I said, I'm in a good mood today. I'm excited to be here. And our topic today is actually going to be a multi-week topic, and it's something that I'm happy I'm in a good mood as we're talking about, because it's actually something that can get me pretty fired up. And I have noticed, I mean, if you remember from the last episode, I think it was 7, we reviewed the movie David and gave a very stern critique of the movie. I still have some friends that bust my chops about how stern I was in that about the movie. And then before that, we had our interview with Dr. Matthew Everhart talking about worshiptainment within the church. And then, before that, we had No Borrowed Convictions. Before that, we had Keith Foskey on talking about biblical change and the importance of biblical change, standing on biblical change. We had Eat the Meat, Spit Out the Bones. And then I don't remember what episode 2 was, but episode 1 was our welcoming episode. But they've been building up to something that I really didn't realize what we were building to. I actually had some other ideas to go into, but as I've been praying about what to go into next, I've realized I wanted to, and I need to look at what is the culture of the church that we're in now, and how did we get here? How did we get here to this hyper-emotionalistic church? Everything we do is hyper-emotional. We can't even disagree on things without getting hyper-emotional. People get mad, people get upset, people throw darts, people talk behind people's backs, because we like what we have, because we like the feeling and the goosebumps that the church gives us today and the routine that we've gotten in with the church. But the question is, how did we get here, and is it biblical? And I don't believe where the church has gone abroad, is biblical, especially in the West, especially in the United States. I don't believe it's biblical. I don't think that we are meant to as image bearers of God, to embrace and to properly use our emotions as God has given them to us. I went through a long season where I said that anger was sinful, but it's not. Anger is an emotion given to us by God for a specific purpose and a specific reason. But how we act in that anger is where the sin comes in. And it's the same with, I would even say, happiness. We can be sinfully happy. We can be sinfully sad. We can be sinfully hungry. We can be sinfully angry. We can be sinfully, fill in emotion here. But the emotions that we have are given to us by God. Even in the anxiety, God has given it to us as a almost like the check engine light on your dash, right? It's like, hey, something's not right here. And it's not to dwell in the anxiety, but to give it to God, the great mechanic, if you will. And so he can help us and he can work in us to fix these things. This is why Philippians 4, 6, and 7 says to cast all our anxieties to God with prayer and supplication, and then he will give us the peace that passeth all understanding. And so, again, emotion is not bad. It's the misuse of emotion. And it's the focus on emotion and the doctoring of emotion that's within the church that is bad. And quite honestly, I do believe that this stems from a man named Charles Finney. There are a lot of people who have done improper things within the church that have caused us to have improper views, but we've relatively done well in acknowledging the error or the heresy that these people demonstrate. You think of Pelagius, and we'll actually get deeper into Pelagianism in another episode of this series. But you have Pelagius, who really honed in and focused on the man's ability and man-centered religion. You have oh man, I'm drawing a blank. Those that would really fight against the Trinity. You had Athanasius, who really fought for the triune God. You have Saint Nicholas, who really defended the deity of Christ. And so we have men that have stood up for the faith and have really fought against heresy throughout church history. And even still, we go back to the Reformation, where you have the likes of Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, John Knox, who fought against the errors of the Catholic Church. Well, Charles Finney was somebody who we didn't really fight against his ideas. In fact, quite the opposite. We started to embrace them, and even in some what would be considered conservative seminaries have even honored him as a hero of the faith. Some of them have statues of him within, or halls named after him, or whatever it might be. We have honored Charles Finney, and quite honestly, I believe that Charles Finney doesn't deserve any honor. Charles Finney was one of the ones who really damaged the church in America. And ironically, it was done through a season of quote-unquote revival. And so as we look at Charles Finney, as we look at how we got to the emotionalistic state of the church, we got to look at how did we get here? What was the product, or what built Charles Finney in his thinking? Because Charles Finney didn't come onto the scene until the early first quarter-ish of the 1800s. And so, we have to get there, right? And so as I was doing research this week, I actually started really thinking about, okay, so Charles Finney was a product of what's called the Second Great Awakening. And so we have to look at the First Great Awakening. And I started thinking, okay, so what led to the First Great Awakening? Because the First Great Awakening was from the 1730s through the 1940s. Some would say even the I keep saying 19, it's the 1730s through the 1740s. And really was big within the American colonies and a little bit in Great Britain. But what led to the First Great Awakening? And you go back even further, and you have the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, I truly think, is the part that we have to look at first and foremost. Because the Enlightenment was a period of time from the early 1600s to the early 1700s. It was about 100 years, and it followed the Reformation. It followed the Reformation, and the Reformation itself followed the Renaissance. So people were really starting to challenge tradition. People were really starting to challenge the way that we've always done things. And on a spiritual side of things, on the church side of things, we're challenging the medieval Catholic Church. The Catholic Church that had built a man-focused worship of the Pope, who had added works-based religion into their study, or their view of salvation and of the church in general. And so even their view of sin and the pardon of sin had become so wildly perverse that it was when Martin Luther was reading in Galatians, I think he was actually in the process of translating Galatians, he came to realize that we are saved by grace alone. We are justified by grace. We are justified through repenting to the Father and coming by faith to Jesus Christ, not by paying penance. And so Martin Luther he put for a scholarly debate an Enlightenment idea of scholarly debate onto the church. A Renaissance idea of scholarly debate. He hammered it into the Wittenberg Church. We know those as his 95 Theses. And he basically has been said to be the bell ringer, where he didn't mean to ring the bell. He was climbing up the ladder to ring the bell of the to ring the bell, and he slipped and he fell and he held onto the rope of the bell, and it rang out the Reformation. And so there was no intention for Luther to begin the Reformation, but that's what God did. God allowed for that to happen. And so you have the Protestant Reformation that happens throughout the 1500s. And during that time, also, you have a scientific revolution that's happening at the same time. So you have Sir Isaac Newton and you have Galileo and those likes working at the same time, challenging the thoughts of physics, the thoughts of astronomy, the thoughts of chemistry, biology, all these things that we had considered beforehand. They started looking at these things differently. You even have the different views on whether the Earth is center of the solar system or the sun is the center of the solar system. We have just differing views that are coming up, and we're having these discussions, and higher thinking begins to really take root. And so you have the Renaissance, that builds into just fine art and humanism, and honestly, just liberalism starts to really take root there. And you have the Protestant Reformation that says, hey, you know what? The Renaissance showed a lot of issues with the Catholic Church, and so we're going to fight against this, and we're going to protest and take back the biblical understanding of the Church, and break this tradition that's been there through the medieval Church. And so you have the Renaissance that leads to the Protestant Reformation, that also just that higher thinking leads to a scientific revolution, while all in the meantime in the 1400s, you have something called the printing press that is invented by Gutenberg, which allows for these materials of the Reformation, of the Enlightenment, or of the scientific revolution, and of the Renaissance to start to be pushed out around the world, around the masses. And so people's thinking begins to be challenged. And in that, you start to have what's called the Enlightenment. And you may have heard of Enlightenment philosophers. So if you think back to Greek philosophy, you have the likes of Plato and Aristotle, and I even got myself right here, some Homer, right? You have those philosophical thinkings of the Greek era, right? But you also have Enlightenment philosophy, and this is where you start to get the likes of John Locke and Montesquieu and Immanuel Kant, right? And they all have different ideas about the human mind. They have different ideas about society. They have different ideas about nations. And they're challenging these ideas, and they're challenging how nations work as a whole. And so the Enlightenment begins to really challenge man's thinking. And so the Enlightenment leads from the 1600s into the 1700s. The core shift here is authority increasingly grounded in autonomous human reason rather than revelation. So the Enlightenment actually was not a time of religious growth, of religious thought. It was a time of human reasoning, of human thought, thinking that the human is divine, and the human is the one that has this autonomy and this free will, something that was actually quite contrary to the Protestant Reformation in a lot of ways. And so that's almost you constantly see a back and forth, right, in this era, a back and forth of Well, this, human thought, God sovereignty, human thought, God sovereignty, human thought, God sovereignty. And so from the Reformation, you have God's sovereignty ping pong back to the Enlightenment that is all about human autonomy, about free will. And so the Enlightenment then leads to, in the colonies and in Great Britain, to what we call the First Great Awakening. And this is off of the coattails of other things such as the Puritan Age of Great Britain. You also have Holy Wars. You have the 30 Years' War. You have a bunch of different wars going on within the church or within society here. And so the First Great Awakening begins in the 1730s. And it's within the Great Awakening that, again, we're ping-ponging back and forth in this era. God's sovereignty, man's free will. God's sovereignty, man's autonomy. God's sovereignty, man's thinking. And so the First Great Awakening was, again, back into the side of God's sovereignty. You have the likes of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield were staunch 5-point Calvinists. Jonathan Edwards was a Princetonian professor. He was actually the grandfather of Aaron Burr. That Aaron Burr, the one who shot Alexander Hamilton. And so you have Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. George Whitefield was a revivalist who would go out and preach. Jonathan Edwards still would go around and preach, but was more on the academic side of things. And they really focused on the sovereignty of God. You have, Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And I'll post a link down below. So if you have not read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, it's not a book, it's a sermon, but it is a little bit longer. I'd recommend reading it. It is convicting. And so you start to have that likes. You have George Whitefield, who is preaching in the meantime, and he's preaching about revival, but revival coming from God. You cannot doctor revival. Revival has to come from the Spirit, just as we read just a moment ago in John chapter 3, that we have to be born again. We have to be born of the Spirit. We cannot see the kingdom of God lest we first be born of the Spirit. And that was done through a heavy emphasis in the preaching of the Word of God. And so you saw God's sovereignty really being discussed in the United States, or it wasn't the United States yet, in the American colonies. You have it being really discussed in Great Britain. And it really was a response in part to the Enlightenment rationalism. And so the Enlightenment, again, we have the back and forth, the ping pong ball going back and forth. And so the Great Awakening was a moment in church history, in the Western church, where the ideas of the Puritans get brought in, because remember, who were the ones that were coming over here to the Americas? It was those that were seeking gold. It was those that were seeking glory, and it was those that were seeking freedom of religion, or if we want to say it, this is how my history teacher taught me all the way back in high school, and I still remember this: God, gold, and glory. The Puritans were the ones who wanted religious freedom. They wanted to be able to escape the persecution that was happening in Great Britain. Because remember, in Great Britain in the time of the Puritans, it was going back and forth. Again, Protestant, Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Protestant, Catholic. There were multiple ping pong matches happening in this time. And so the Puritans, even though they were fighting their war, the English Civil War over in England, they wanted to also have their place where they could truly have religious freedom from the crown. And so you have Puritan ideas, which are highly Calvinist, highly centered on prayer, highly focused on holy living, on full display within the culture of the Americas. And we really start to see that influenced in the founding of seminaries, such as Princeton Seminary and Harvard Seminary. And you have men like Jonathan Edwards that are leading these things. And so it's highly Puritan, highly Calvinist, highly post-millennial. There is a hope that this fire that is being stirred up in these preachers that will one day turn America, this land that they have just started to conquer, into a fully Christian nation. A nation that is bound by God's law, a nation that is bound by God's sovereignty, a nation that is distinctly Christian and not pagan. And so there's a hope in the First Great Awakening that God will do this work. And that is important to note. God will do this work. But in the 1740s, the Great Awakening, the first one, starts to die down, and something else begins to happen, where now, rather than Great Awakening and religious ideals coming in, the people of America are starting to get stirred up. And you have men who are starting to read the likes of John Locke and Montesquieu and Kant. And remember, we're going back and forth, ping pong ball, right? And the ping pong ball starts to shift back toward the idea of man's free will and man's ability, and honestly, democratic ideas as well. And so you have Thomas Paine's Common Sense that's written and distributed throughout the United States, or throughout the colonies. I keep on saying the United States, but we're not there yet. Throughout the colonies. You have Leviathan spread out throughout the colonies. You have Enlightenment ideas starting to take root in the colonies. And you start to have civil distress starting to take over in the colonies. And you have a demand for taxation, a demand for if you're going to tax us, then we're going to have equal representation in Congress. If you are going to expect us to serve in your military, we need similar protections. Government, we are not your slaves, and there's an irony there, but we are not your slaves. We are not your property. We are individuals, and we demanded to be treated as the British citizens that we are. The Crown didn't like that. Parliament didn't like that. And so originally, we like to put the blame on the Crown, but it was really Parliament that was the issue. The Revolution was a war against, yes, the Crown of England, but the Parliament of England. And so you have these ideas, and you have men like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who are bought into these Enlightenment ideas. And you know what? As much as we like to say that they were Christians, they were what are called deists. Deists had the idea that God created everything, God created man, and then God left us to our own devices. And so God is out there somewhere, but he's pretty much watching us from a screen and just letting us do whatever we want. And there was no miraculous. It was all man. And so even Thomas Jefferson took the Bible and cut out the parts that he thought were too miraculous, and it's called the Jefferson Bible, and he cut out all the miracles of Christ and anything that he thought that was too miraculous. And so you start having this liberalism, and this liberal ideas start coming into our thinking here in the in the Americas. And so in the 1770s, us proud Americans, we know what happened. We declared war on the Crown of England, and we declared our independence from the Crown of England. We fought in a war, and in 1783, September 17th, 1783, we signed our Constitution. And here's a fun fact. My child is due on September 17th, and so let's go. Constitution, baby. But our Constitution is founded, and it is signed, and it is enacted into law by those 13 colonies. And within our Constitution are full of, yes, it is rooted in Scripture, but it's also rooted in Enlightenment ideas. It is actually a document of syncretism, synchronizing the ideas of the Great Awakening and of the Reformation, and synchronizing the ideas of the Enlightenment. That is the American Constitution. And so you have, men that think that it should be void of religion, that we should have full freedom of religion no matter what. You have other men that were saying that you should have a document that is strictly Christian, because remember, the purpose of the Great Awakening was to make this land that we were conquering into a Christian language, a Christian nation. And so you have the charters of the colonies all requiring some faithfulness to God within the church and a profession of faith. So yes, Christianity, or America in itself within the colonies, was a Christian nation because all 13 colonies required a profession of faith. And so you have the Constitution of the United States that is founded on Enlightenment ideas. The freedom of man, the sovereignty of the people, not the sovereignty of a king. And we as Christians know that our king is Jesus Christ. And it conflicts with this idea of a sovereign. And so as America, now I can start saying the United States, starts to develop itself, you begin to have what's called the Second Great Awakening. And again, we're taking the ping pong, but there's an issue, is that the ping pong doesn't bounce back after the American Revolution. It stays on the side of man's free will and man's decision and man's autonomy and man's thinking throughout the 1840s. And so it is within the 1790s around to the 1840s, it's a longer period of time, you have what is called the Second Great Awakening. And this is now where there you have the synchronizing or syncretism of the Enlightenment ideas and Christianity. And so it's highly, instead of Calvinist, it's highly Arminian. It's highly focused on man's choice. And you start to see the coming of what we would now know as revival meetings, camp meetings, and those kind of things. It paves the path for crusades like Billy Graham or like Greg Laurie, right? Those kind of crusades. Or eventually what we would call the altar call. And so what the Second Great Awakening is, it is very American. It takes place a little bit in southern Canada and a little bit in England, but is mostly on the American frontier. And you have circuit riders, Methodist circuit riders, who are running the circuit, if you will, preaching camp meetings and establishing and really trying to schedule revival. This is where we start getting the idea of scheduling revival meetings, that if we just schedule it at the right time, God will do a work. But then it starts to also turn into, well, if we can set the mood right, then God can do a work. Or if we start to really preach the word in a way that hits the heart just right, then we know that instead of now God doing the work, now you start seeing, well, then these people will come by faith on their own. If we just make it right, we set the stage, if we set the mood, then people will start to come on their own. And this is really, really fostered by a man named Charles Finney. And I'm not going to talk too much about Finney right now because this whole series is about Finney. But we're looking at what led to Finney. And so revival is now, rather than God-focused, it's now method-focused. And you have the likes of Methodism, right? Method. How can we doctor the idea? And so they took a lot of Wesleyan ideas, mixed it with Arminian ideas, Wesleyan is Arminian, but Wesley's ideas, high Arminianism, and Enlightenment ideas coming all in and focusing now that the revival is man-focused. Honestly, if I can say it this way, it's very contradictory for a Baptist or a Presbyterian to fall into these ideas. Because even as a Baptist, I'm a 5-point Calvinist Baptist, but there are very few Baptists, unless you're a free will Baptist, who deny, there are very few that would deny what we would call eternal security, or I would be more apt to call it perseverance of the saints, right? More, you also have once saved, always saved, right? But once saved, always saved actually takes the ideas of this revivalism, where if we can just get them to say the magic prayer, then I know that they'll be saved. And even if they go living their life, this is what's the difference between once saved, always saved and perseverance of the saints, is that if we can just get them to bow their heads and say this magic prayer and feel it in that moment, then they're saved. And even if they go and they start living in gross sexual sin, they are still gay, they are stealing from people, they're cussing like sailors, they are on drugs, they're addicted to alcohol, all these other things, it's okay, but they said their magic prayer at a revival meeting. And so that's the difference between once saved, always saved, and then you have perseverance of the saints, where those who are truly saved will persevere in the faith until the end. That God did the work, God got us into it, and so God keeps us in. But what the Second Great Awakening really starts to put into practice and into motion is you say this magic prayer, but now, at least they're consistent. You bow your head, you have your anxious moment, but now you have to keep yourself in. This is where at least the Second Great Awakening is consistent, and those that hold to this idea of the anxious bench in a non-Baptistic way is consistent, because at least then, if you got yourself into it, you have to keep yourself in, which is legalism. Easy believism leads to legalism, because again, if you truly say that you have to believe and that's all you have to do, which I would agree that it's by faith, but you have to do it. You have to do the work. You have to do all these things. But you have to keep yourself in. That's what Finney taught. That's what Methodists teach, right? That if you can just come, you can just get saved, you will be saved, but now you have to hold to a standard, or else you will lose your salvation. You are not right with God, and you know what? You cannot be perfectly holy, and you cannot be in the presence of God if you are not holy, because only holiness can be in the presence of God. And so, again, the Second Great Awakening, much longer, much more emotional, much more emotion-driven, dealing with the anxieties of man. And if I can say it this way, it's very psychological. They're dealing with the psyche of man. If they can make man feel bad enough for the wrong that they have done and want to be right and not do the bad that they had been doing, or at least what they are saying is bad, then they can come in and get saved, and we can rack up numbers. And things like that. And so it's extremely method-driven, and it is really derivative of the democratic ideas of the Enlightenment. And so salvation is a work of man, and it is highly, rather than theo or God-centric, it's really anthro or man-centric. We focus on man. We focus on man's ideas and man's calling and man's work. Because again, remember, that's what the Enlightenment did. That's what the Enlightenment focused on. And we were watching the ping pong ball go back and forth, and we go back to the Protestant Reformation, which started to really challenge tradition. Even the Renaissance really started challenging traditions of art and literature and music and architecture. The Renaissance starting to challenge these medieval principles. Then the Protestant Reformation starting to challenge the tradition of the church and the tradition of man rather than the scriptures of God. Then you have the Enlightenment that's challenging the traditions of thinking. And then you have now the Second Great Awakening that is challenging even those Reformation ideas that we sought to fight for in the 1500s. And what the Puritans really fought for in in England, the reasons why we came over here in the first place. But the Enlightenment ideas of the American Revolution and the French Revolution makes its way into the church. And it becomes very man-focused. And so you have now different ideas. So you have, here's a theological comparison on revival. The First Great Awakening saw it as a sovereign act of God. The Second Great Awakening as encouraged through methods. Anthropology, or the study of man, total depravity, or man's complete inability, is emphasized. Whereas the Second Great Awakening focuses on optimistic human ability. The ability that humans can do these things and we don't need God to do these things, or we can lead man to God rather than the other way around. Conversion is carefully examined, and conversion that's in the First Great Awakening, and in the Second Great Awakening, it's a public response. It's very much, hey guys, look at me. Look at what I just did. And then you have, again, in relationship to the Enlightenment, this is really, I really do think this is where it came from. And what we have in the church today is a direct response to the Second Great Awakening and a continuation and the syncretism of the Enlightenment to the church in America that now leads to today, that leads to what we have going on now. And so you have the First Great Awakening that resisted this rationalism. And then you have the Second Great Awakening that embraces individualism, which is rooted in that rationalism. And so, again, you have these theological differences within the First and Second Great Awakenings. One led up to the American Revolution, and one was a result of the American Revolution. Now, I am a proud American. I love the nation I live in. I want this nation. I have the hope of the First Great Awakening that this nation will be a truly Christian nation, not in the way that our politicians are saying that's going to be a Christian nation, but I do believe that God is going to continue to build his church within America, and that we will one day, as discipleship happens, as hospitality is performed, as the family is emphasized, as fathers run their homes properly, America will one day be, and it may not be in my lifetime, it probably won't be in my lifetime, it'll probably be in 100 to 200 years, America will be a fully Christian nation, just as it was hoped for when it was planted. I love America, don't get me wrong, but as we look at what we've been through, and the ideas in which that we've come to, we've synchronized all of this, and we've brought it in, and we've allowed it to permeate and become part of the church. And so we have an American church, an American gospel, that as we look further along the line, next week we're going to look at Charles Finney as a whole. The next week after that, we're going to look at the destructive heritage of Charles Finney. And it'll either be included in that week's episode or the following week's episode. We will look at the modern church and the influence of the Enlightenment, of the Second Great Awakening, and of Charles Finney on what we have today and how we've got here. So much. The prosperity gospel is rooted in this. The cults are rooted in this. Highly emotionalistic worship is, or as Matthew Everhart said, worshiptainment is focused in this and rooted in this. The praise band movement is rooted in this. Even in the independent fundamental Baptist, I still remember being the one who was standing off to the side as the preacher said, every head bowed and every eye closed, nobody's looking around, and it's quiet in the room except for the piano and playing very softly with me very softly singing, I Surrender All or Just As I Am, coming forward and just giving that altar call. It's all rooted in this. And we have to be willing to acknowledge that. We have to be willing to acknowledge that the Second Great Awakening and Finneyism and all of these things are rooted in the Enlightenment ideas of individualism and the destruction of sovereign rule. And so that is this week's episode of the 116 podcast. I'm so glad that you have been here with me today. This is actually a lot of fun for me. I have a deep love for history. As much as I am a theology boy, theology bro, I love history. I love history. You can't see my history books are all over here. And so I am excited to continue to look at this and look at church history, and church history being something that many Christians, many American Christians just don't know about. They either are ignorant of it, they choose to ignore it, or they've been taught incorrectly. And so I am excited for the next coming episodes as we look here at American church history, as we look at emotionalism and Enlightenment perversion through Charles Finney. Hey, thanks for being here with me today. We'll hopefully see you next week on the 116 podcast. We'll talk to you later. Have a great day.